Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Alrighty, folks, what is up, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your Thursday and Sunday host, Grady Duggan, and I hope you all are having a wonderful Thursday afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time of the day you're listening to this at. Hey, even if it's not Thursday, I hope you are having a wonderful day today. We have a jam-packed show to get into, so I don't want to be wasting too much of your guys' time. We're going to be going over NFL training camps are getting ready to gear up and open. We're going to talk about kind of the procedures that are going into that, what it means for the players, what it means for their coaches, just kind of the whole process that the NFL is looking at in this crazy world of COVID-19. In that part of the podcast, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about why some of the decisions the NFL has made regarding the preseason and just the regular season in general will affect certain aspects of the fantasy football world. And then I'm going to be kind of divulging in the quarterback position once again. We're going to be going over some quarterbacks that are really some interesting case studies when it comes to the upcoming fantasy football season. There's some quarterbacks that kind of unclear how they might perform, but then there's also a couple quarterbacks I want to talk about that I think could maybe surprise you or just be very good, consistent performers for you at the quarterback position, as well as some players that you just cannot pass up for your draft that I'm sure is coming up soon, because let's be honest, it is July 23rd when this episode will be published. Rookies are supposed to be reporting on this past Monday, July 21st. Rookies were supposed to report around the league. It kind of differs depending on where the team is and how the coronavirus situation is in certain areas of the country. But then, last but not least, the rest of the teams are all reporting July 28th, next Monday, and we will finally have some real football to talk about, some real topics, whether it's what's going on in training camps, how news is coming out, how the media is working, how different teams are handling the coronavirus, and really just how people are performing. We can actually talk some real football, so I'm looking forward to it. But as we get into this episode, enough about what we're going to talk about, and let's get to the talking. What I want to take a look at, it's a broad subject. It's a subject that it's not exactly fantasy football, and it's not fun to be talking about, but we are having an NFL season. It is coming up right around the corner, and since we are in a global pandemic, there is a lot of different aspects that need to be discussed, and they need to be discussed often. Because one, as much as it might not be the most entertaining thing to listen about and hear about. It's going to affect and impact the fantasy football world in what decisions you need to be making, what you need to be looking out for, maybe some depth pieces that are going to be crucial in a fantasy football roster, depending on how many bench players you have. So it's really one of the more unique, if not the most unique seasons anyone has seen in the NFL in recent years. And there's just a lot to unpack, if I do say so myself. I mean, there's no other way around it, to be quite frank. The first big decision that the NFL and the NFLPA, that is the Players Association, have come to an agreement on, and that is different from most years, is the roster size heading into training camp is going to be cut by 10 players. So instead of teams having 90 players when they report for training camp, teams are only going to have 80. And you might say only. I mean, you still have 80 players. But when it comes down to training camp and making these roster cuts and figuring out who makes the final roster, you would be surprised at how many times it is that back half and back final 10 players that come into the preseason and come into training camp, make a name for themselves, and make their way onto the 53-man roster. And now, one thing that I was talking about earlier that is different this year is the NFL is allowing more players on the practice squad, and it usually was a 46-man active roster for game days. This year it's going to be a 48-man active roster. So there's a lot of little roster numbers that, as much as people don't realize how big of a deal that is, if you're a general manager, you're a head coach, that is huge. That is enormous when making certain decisions and having the flexibility to hold maybe one or two more guys at certain positions. For example, I know one thing that is going to be big this year is the quarterback position, which I will get into later a little more detailed, but most teams generically hold two quarterbacks. With COVID going on, that is going to make the quarterback position even that much more valuable, and coaches are going to do everything in their power to not lose their quarterbacks. So if one quarterback goes down, they're in the QB room, they're in meetings together, it's a scary likely chance that other quarterbacks have a good chance in getting this virus. So they want to have as many quarterbacks on the roster spread out as far as possible so that if one gets it, they can have 2 to 3 other good options. So expect a lot of teams to be holding 3 quarterbacks this coming season. And that is one thing to take a look at when you are drafting quarterbacks. Maybe what is the backup there? If someone gets it, do you have a good option to go right into that same team, same quarterback room, and stream that guy for a couple weeks? So as we move forward talking about the preseason and kind of this interesting training camp, one other thing to discuss that is worth talking about is the fact that there will be no preseason games. It is all training camp. It is all scrimmaging against your own team. I'd be surprised if we don't get some streams of these games. I'm sure fans will be able to watch some live scrimmages that will allow some people to stand out and really make their case for the rosters. Some undrafted free agent guys will play well and make their name be known, whether to be the team that they're on or if they're cut and other teams around the league see their film. But the fact of the matter is there are, no matter what, going to be some players that could have had a real shot and real opportunity to get into the NFL that are going to kind of miss out on that, because NFL general managers and head coaches, when they're making these roster decisions, there's going to be guys that might be just as good as the person they are battling for a position, but that person has 2 to 3 years under their belt, just a little bit more experience. They know how to handle themselves as a professional athlete. They know how the NFL works. They might have been there for a couple years, so they understand the system. And in a season that is so kind of volatile in a way because of this coronavirus, NFL roster kind of decision makers are going to be less likely to take that gamble and take that risk on a player who could potentially be a star. I mean, under free agents have become big stars in this league. You look at Wes Welker, you look at Kurt Warner. I mean, that Tony Romo was an undrafted free agent. There are guys who come into the NFL undrafted and really make a name for themselves. And I'm not saying that's not going to happen this year, because 100% there's bigger rosters. There's things that combat these type of deficiencies that are going to be seen with the NFL this year, that there are going to be opportunities, but the opportunities are going to be much, much less. Like, for example, with these scrimmages that maybe fans might get to see with a stream, they're not going to be 4-quarter games, highly unlikely. And with a shortened kind of preseason, if you even call it a preseason, since there's no actual games, they're not going to have as many reps. Teams are going to want to put their starters in and get their starters the most out of their reps, because that's their only warm-up and amp-up to this season. So it's really a bummer that there are going to be some guys who miss out on an opportunity, and that's just the nature of the beast this year. We're playing an NFL season during a global pandemic. There are a lot of things that are not going to be the same, and that's okay. That's something you got to roll with the punches and just go with. So that is one aspect to kind of take a look at and really keep a close eye on some position battles as you inch closer to your fantasy football draft. Don't make those risky picks as often as you should. Kind of keep it safe with the guys you know. And I'll get in later in the episode with some must-have guys you can't miss, whether it's round 1 to 3 or 6 to 8. Just some guys who are going to be good core players in the fantasy football world. Now, another thing I want to talk about with this interesting preseason setup, or if it's even a preseason, this interesting training camp setup is a better way to say it. If you have kept up with the world of football and the news that has been coming out, until this week, the NFL had not really released a plan on how they were going to combat this coronavirus. What was their player safeties protocols put in place? What were they going to be doing if players got sick? How do they social distance? You know, there was a lot of things that just went unsaid. And if you were on social media, several players came out and voiced their opinions with the hashtag #WeWantToPlay, but at what cost? Richard Sherman, J.J. Watt, Devontae Adams, handfuls of athletes came out and really voiced their concern with what was going on. J.J. Watt, I'm going to read you his tweets. He had a lot of good things to say about it. He said, "Once again, in the interest of keeping everyone, players and fans, as informed as possible, here is an updated list of what we as players know and don't know as the first group gets set to report to training camp tomorrow." So this was obviously posted on Sunday night, July 20th, as some of the players were set to report July 21st. So these are things that NFL athletes did not even know as some of their teams were reporting to camp. He said, we want to be as safe as possible. The NFL can mandate that players show up to training camp regardless if any agreement has been reached between the NFL and NFLPA. We still have not granted the full and proper training camp acclimation period necessary as recommended by the medical and training staffs. So that means they haven't been granted the correct amount of time to quarantine, make sure that these guys don't have the coronavirus and aren't bringing it into the locker room. So they haven't been given the proper acclimation period to really adjust to the training camp life. Especially a lot of these guys don't live during the offseason in the cities they play. So these guys are traveling into the cities and they're not given the correct amount of time to acclimate to these cities and get in there and quarantine to be safe as they ramp up for preseason. He also said they don't know if there will be daily testing, every other day testing, or they just don't know about testing. And that is one thing I want to correct, because that has come out since all these players voiced their concern. The NFL has come out with a little bit of a plan, not a full season or full training camp, but they have informed players that during the first 2 weeks of training camp, they will be tested every single day. So that is a good thing. That is something to get the season started, to get everything going smoothly. These players should be tested every single day to make sure they don't have it, make sure they're not bringing it into the locker rooms and really reducing the risk of a full locker room spread, because let's be honest, that is exactly how they're going to get in trouble and really will be the serious repercussions on the season if that happens. If some team has a serious breakout, 15 guys all of a sudden come down sick with the coronavirus, how do you play on Sunday? That's just the cold hard truth about it. But that is good that they're going to be testing every day, making sure it stays out. And there's some interesting facts that go along with these guidelines. And it shows that the NFL is kind of going to be rolling with the punches in a way and just seeing how this plans out. So ESPN reported that they will require daily testing for the first 2 weeks of the training camp. After 2 weeks, if the positivity test rate, so the amount of tests that are positive, is below 5%, the league is going to slowly scale back testing to testing every other day. If the positive test rate is not below 5%, they will continue with daily testing until it begins to decrease, which is good. The CDC and medical professionals have 5% has always been the threshold for the government and local governments. If it's above 5%, the medical experts are saying that they should slow down the opening and the economy shouldn't be opening. So the NFL is keeping that 5% rate and saying if it's above it, they're going to be testing every day, trying to get these testing rates down and control the virus. If it's below it, they're going to scale it back, go to every other day. And really, that's just a money-saving maneuver on their part, which I understand, this, as much as we don't like to admit it, and a lot of fans are in it for the entertainment, these are businesses. These are cash cows, and they want to make the most money possible, which you can't really blame them in a way. And one thing that is worth noting, and it's just interesting, is that there are still places around this country that are struggling to get tests. If you have symptoms, there are places you can't receive a test. And now NFL athletes are going to be tested every single day. It's an interesting cost that the NFL is paying to play this season, and it makes you wonder if sports should be played right now. And I know, trust me, I am guilty. I am one of the top ones that will admit I want sports back. I want some entertainment, but at what cost? It's just some things that sports aren't as big. There are bigger things than sports. So it's one thing that you have to take into mind, take into consideration. But the fact of the matter is football is rolling ahead, full head of steam, and there is going to be a season. And one thing that I saw, which was ridiculous, Pro Football Talk reported the NFL is spending $75 million on testing. Their plan is a $75 million plan. And that just shows that's why they can get all these tests. It's because they're coughing up the dough. So it makes sense. All these private medical companies are producing these tests and they're saying, hey, we'll buy them. So you can't blame the NFL for it. It shows how much money is on the line and why these owners, coaches, head coaches, GMs, and players want to play, but they just want to do it safely, which you really cannot blame them for, as they should, especially when you take into consideration that a lot of these guys have families, they're husbands, they're fathers. So they have people to be considerate of, and as much as they want to play, this is their livelihood, they got to keep everyone in their household safe. And that is just the fact of what is going on in this world. You got to take the right precautions. And as much as we want sports to be back, they need to be going about it in the correct way so that it can be sustainable for fans, players, the ownership, just everyone involved. So there's a lot to unpack within the coronavirus and sports world, how they are married together, what to do. And this is a conversation that people don't want to have, but it could go on for hours. Let's be honest. There's a lot to discuss. And that's why I wanted to kind of bring it up to you guys, have an open conversation about some things I'm seeing around the league, some things that are worth being discussed, because it's going to impact our fantasy football drafts as it inches closer. And let's be honest, we are maybe 2-3 weeks away from getting into these drafts. So it's an exciting time, but you got to realize what's going on in the world and how that could have an impact on your fantasy team. If you have any control or any say in it, hit up your commissioner and fight to get some extra bench spots or injured reserve spots in your fantasy football season this year, because there are going to be people who get sick. There are going to be people who are out for a week or two, if not more, and you just have to roll with the punches and realize what is coming. So that is that. Now, I promise the rest of the episode is going to be football, football, football. Stay tuned. After the break, we are going to be talking about some interesting, kind of controversial quarterbacks that some I might say, hey, this is a draftable guy in this certain round. Some I might tell you to veer away from. There's a lot of aspects that go into drafting a quarterback that I've talked about, that I'm going to continue talking about, because I want you guys to be the most informed fantasy football drafter as you head in to these drafts. So thank you for listening to my little rant about the coronavirus, and I promise that is over for this episode. So stick around after the break, and let's talk some quarterbacks.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, welcome back everybody to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed the first part of the show where we talked about what to expect in NFL training camps and how exactly that has an opportunity to impact your fantasy football drafts and your rosters and the depth chart that you are going to be wanting to build as you prepare for these drafts. So a lot of good things to unpack, a lot of good things to focus on as the season inches closer. So why not talk more about the most controversial fantasy football position, the quarterback. And on top of it being a very volatile position to talk about, I'm going to be talking about and discussing in depth a certain couple of quarterbacks that people harp on a lot and really put into question as to how they perform, whether they have fantasy football value. And the first one up is someone who never quite seems to get the respect that a lot of his peers thinks he deserves. He plays it cool a lot of the time. And yes, I am talking about San Francisco 49er quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, he is one of the more interesting and compelling quarterbacks to discuss heading into this season. He was traded to the 49ers in 2017, the final back half of the season. He originally did not play until C.J. Beathard got hurt, as well as Nick Mullins kind of was thrust into the starting role, and he took a terrible San Francisco 49er team and turned around and won 5 games under Kyle Shanahan for the 49ers. So that right there showed you this guy can win in the league. He can perform under pressure as an NFL quarterback, and the 49ers turned around in the offseason heading into the 2018 season and gave him what was at the time the largest contract in NFL history. Now, we all know that got blown out of the water multiple times since then, and now we have Patrick Mahomes getting what could be a $500 million contract. And no, I did not stutter there. So obviously now looking back on it, that Jimmy Garoppolo contract has really the potential to be quite the little bargain for the 49ers. But he turned around and tore his ACL against the Chiefs in week 2 of the 2018 season. So this 2019 season was the first year he was able to be a full-time starter in the NFL. And we must note that the 2019 season was his 5th or 6th. It was his 6th season in the NFL. So finally, it's not like he is some young rookie or second or third guy. It was his 6th year in the NFL where he finally got his first full season under his belt. And let's be honest, it wasn't too shabby. 49ers went 13-3 on their way to their first Super Bowl appearance since the Jim Harbaugh days. Jimmy Garoppolo threw 3,978 yards with 27 touchdowns, but 13 interceptions. So kind of a high interceptions, and a lot of his interceptions were very questionable throws. So there's a lot of skepticism that this guy really locks on to his receivers and chooses one receiver to throw the ball to. But let me give you a couple reasons as why I think Jimmy Garoppolo is worth the fantasy football draft pick. I mean, I'm not talking take him in the first 6 or 7 rounds, but if he's there in the 7 to 9 round range, there is a lot of positive traits that he could have towards your fantasy football season. And one of the big things that people don't take into consideration is that Kyle Shanahan's offense is the most complex offense in the NFL. It takes a lot of time to get used to that offense, and especially calling the plays, remembering it to all the way to the huddle. It took Matt Ryan a year or 2 to get under the belt, and when he finally did, he had an MVP season, threw for almost 5,000 yards. So, I mean, once people get comfortable in Kyle Shanahan's system, they really take off. And this is going to be Jimmy Garoppolo's 2nd year as the full-time starter. Do not be surprised if this man really surprises some people. I just want to take a couple notes from Jimmy Garoppolo in 2019. He had more passing yards than Deshaun Watson, who is going to be going much higher than him in fantasy football drafts. I know this is a crazy stat that you don't want to believe, and I am not saying to value him higher than what I'm about to say, but more passing touchdowns than Patrick Mahomes. He had a better completion percentage than Russell Wilson and a higher passer rating than Aaron Rodgers. This is all in his first full season as a starter coming off of an ACL tear. So there's a lot of things to improve on, but he also did a lot of things well. The 49ers offense as a whole was one of the best offenses on third downs too. And one thing that's big about that you need to discuss is that keeps an offense on the field. That allows quarterbacks to continue passing the ball, continue racking up these fantasy points, and that is why I rate Jimmy Garoppolo a lot higher than people do. I mean, Chris Sims of NBC Sports just put him as like his 18th or 20th best quarterback in the NFL, and I think that is ridiculous. You can have your doubts about him, but he has shown he's a winner. He can play in the NFL. He took his team to the Super Bowl, and yes, he had a lot of players around him, but you don't get to the Super Bowl without a solid quarterback play. Now, you throw Kyle Shanahan into the mix, and there is a lot of reason for optimism. So if you have no quarterback and you need just a solid, consistent quarterback, I think Jimmy Garoppolo is your guy. They're going to lean a little bit more heavily on him, so expect the passing game to improve in San Francisco, and that is a big quarterback to watch. Now, this next one, he's had an interesting NFL career. He's had some lows, but he's also had the highest of the highs, and that is one-time Philadelphia Eagles quarterback, one-time Jacksonville Jaguar quarterback, and now the quarterback of the Chicago Bears, Nick Foles. And now an interesting article came out of the Chicago Tribune today stating that Mitchell Trubisky is most likely going to be the starter for the Chicago Bears. And this relates back to the first segment of the show, and I talked about the coronavirus and no preseason games and how exactly that could impact your drafts. And this is Exhibit A right here, folks. Nick Foles doesn't know the offense yet. Mitchell Trubisky does. He's been there for a couple years under Matt Nagy. And now if you get Nick Foles with a full preseason, full training camp, he's got a couple games under his belt in this offense. With how these two have played in the past, I find it hard to believe that Nick Foles would not be the starter. But now you take everything into consideration. You have no preseason games, a shortened little training camp, just a lot of aspects that fall into it. There's a real chance that Mitchell Trubisky opens this season as the starter. And that is not good for Nick Foles fans, but in a way, it gives Nick Foles a little bit of a shock value for some fantasy football owners, because I'm not high on Mitchell Trubisky. I don't think he lasts long as a starting quarterback, and I think within 3 to 4 games, you are going to see Nick Foles in as the starting quarterback for the rest of the season as the Chicago Bears proceed. And you might want to say, how do you value someone like that who doesn't have a lot of experience in the offense and kind of is new to the team in such an interesting season? But the thing is that they are professionals. This is what they are paid to do. They're going to kind of dole down the offense as he ramps it up so he gets more used to it. So once he gets in there, I expect him to take full control of the offense. And it's not like the Chicago Bears don't have any weapons around him. I mean, they have Allen Robinson, they have Trey Burton, they have a couple good running backs in David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen. So there's people around him that could really help Nick Foles succeed in that position. But I think it's just going to take a couple weeks to get Nick Foles in there. He's going to have a little bit more time getting used to the system when he doesn't have preseason games where he can get live game action snaps. So why is this important to your fantasy football draft? If you value Nick Foles and you think you might want him, you're going to be able to take him in the last 2 or 3 rounds, if not undrafted. Wait till he finally starts and then pick him up off the waiver wire. So that's why he is a name that I think could play well in Matt Nagy's system. Matt Nagy has had great success in the NFL at certain times with quarterbacks. It's not like he hasn't had. There's a reason he's the head coach of the Chicago Bears. They brought him in to be an offensive mastermind and kind of grew Mitchell Trubisky, and that hasn't went as well as people may have thought. So now they're moving on to the Nick Foles experiment, and I think it could be a lot more successful than what we saw with Mitchell Trubisky. So give it a couple weeks and keep Nick Foles on the radar for your fantasy football teams. He's might not be your bona fide starter, but if someone starts struggling, you need a waiver wire pickup, he could be a great option, as well as someone who you have a bye week and you need someone to come in for a week or two and perform. That's your guy right there. So Nick Foles and Jimmy Garoppolo, 2 names to look out for. I obviously value Jimmy Garoppolo a lot higher than Nick Foles just because there is a lot of question marks going in to the Chicago Bears offense with Mitchell Trubisky possibly starting. So that is one thing to take into consideration. But now as we move it forward, someone who is a great face for the NFL and the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that is Gardner Minshew. Minshew mania, as we all saw in the 2019 season. And they shocked a lot of people by not going after either re-signing Nick Foles or going after some free agent quarterbacks or a young QB. They really held to their guns and said, we're going to stick with Gardner Minshew, give him a chance to prove that he can be the franchise guy in Jacksonville. So as you look at Gardner Minshew's rookie season, it wasn't as bad as you think, but also it wasn't as great as you think. So you got to kind of even out, give a little teeter-totter and figure out where you value him. And he didn't start the whole season because they did have Nick Foles before he got hurt. But Gardner Minshew, in a rookie season with not a lot of guys around him in Jacksonville, still managed to throw for 3,200 yards, 21 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. And the fact of the matter is, he was a rookie. It's a huge learning jump for a rookie quarterback especially. So a 6th-round pick, you can only have such expectations as they enter their rookie season, and he really managed that well. He's a fiery personality, so he's got the ability to lead, the confidence to be that franchise guy, and now he's really just got to put that work in and really try and show that he can be the guy in Jacksonville for years to come. And if you look at him, he's got a pretty big 6'1", 230-pound build, so he's a hefty guy. He can stick in the pocket which is something that the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to need with kind of a weak offensive line. And he's got a big arm. He can throw deep. He played in an air raid kind of spread it out offense under Mike Leach at Washington State. So he's used to throwing the ball a lot in football games. But the thing with Gardner Minshew is he just has no one around him. So how much can he really carry the team in Jacksonville when Leonard Fournette is coming off a bad year? There's a lot of kind of animosity down there too. There's a handful of guys who wanted to trade. They've traded a lot of their good players when it was not that long ago. They were in the AFC Championship game. So it's just an interesting time for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And because they don't have a handful of guys around him is why I would kind of steer clear of Gardner Minshew and don't go for him. He is similar to where he could be a solid streamer every maybe 5 weeks. If you have a bye, your quarterback goes down, someone gets sick. Yeah, he could be a solid streamer for a week or two. But to have him as a starter, which I've seen some people value him in the 8 to 10 round range, I think that is crazy. Not worth it. I do not think he has enough talent around him to produce in that value. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the quarterback position. Yes, I say draft late and get some value, but I don't think Gardner Minshew will be that guy for a lot of teams. And now one last quarterback we are going to end this segment on is someone who I am actually very high on this year, and he's always had success at the NFL level. He's been a great quarterback for many years. Some people say he's a Hall of Famer. Some people don't agree so much, and that's why I am going to be talking about newly Indianapolis Colt Phillip Rivers. And out of these 4 quarterbacks I'm talking about, I am by far the highest on Phillip Rivers, not only because he is the most established and kind of the biggest veteran in this group, but I am really high on the Indianapolis Colts. They have a great head coach in Frank Wright and the best offensive line in the NFL with Quentin Nelson. But they also have a lot of weapons around him that are going to allow Phillip Rivers to finally not only have the time, but the weapons to throw to. And that's something he hasn't always had when he was in San Diego and LA. So he has a lot of different dynamics that we're not used to seeing Phillip Rivers with. He's got a better team around him. And we saw when the Chargers were a good team, Phillip Rivers was a baller. There's no other way around it. Now he's got T.Y. Hilton. He's got Jonathan Taylor, who I'm high on. Marlon Mack had a good year last year. There's a lot of guys around him. Michael Pittman is a rookie receiver coming in the league that I think could have a lot of success as kind of a stand-up reception receiver. So I think Phillip Rivers is going to have one of his better years. He hasn't shown a lot of signs of slowing down or anything like that because of his age. He just hasn't had a very good team around him in Los Angeles and San Diego the past few years. So Phillip Rivers is a guy to watch out for. I would put him around maybe the 6 to 8 round range. He is a guy that you don't need to draft super high, but once quarterbacks start falling off the draft board, you can wait a little bit. He's not going to be in the top 8 to 10 quarterbacks a lot of the time. And I think you could get very consistent play out of Phillip Rivers in his first year as an Indianapolis Colt. Just an interesting name to look out for. So Jimmy Garoppolo, Nick Foles, Gardner Minshew, Phillip Rivers, those are some quarterbacks to just keep an eye out for. Jimmy Garoppolo and Phillip Rivers, I am high on. The other two, not as high. Kind of streamer options that I wanted to give you as we get closer to the 2020 season. But stick around after the break. We're going to be talking about some backup running backs that could have value for you.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back, listeners. I hope you guys are enjoying the show thus far. We talked about the coronavirus and what it means for the preseason, how it could impact your fantasy football drafts, as well as going into a handful of quarterbacks that are not as highly talked about as a lot of quarterbacks, but some that could potentially give you some value and some production somewhere down the road in your fantasy football season, which is good to have with the quarterback position. But now let's get right to this next segment. One thing I'm excited about, because these are kind of the players, I'm going to be talking about backup running backs that could give you some value. And the reason I'm excited for this segment is because these are players that you can get later in the draft and they can perform for you. Running backs have become such a running back by committee that backup running backs can get 10 to 12 carries, if not more, every game. And that is enough to do some damage and put up some points. So these are kind of running back 3, maybe even flex players that you can put in and you can have a really good pickup with. So this first guy I'm going to be talking about, someone I have went over before. I am high on him. I've been a fan of him since he was in college, and that is Seattle Seahawks running back Rashad Penny. He's a third-year guy, and his rookie season, he kind of got buried in the depth chart behind Chris Carson. He's a first-rounder, but they didn't use him like that. They didn't really give him the opportunity to succeed in a way that some teams do with the first rounder, and rightfully so. Chris Carson was having a really good year, but 2019 he kind of came into his own a little bit, got off to a slow start, but at the end of the year, well, before he got injured, and that's something I'm going to get into, he did tear his ACL, but the 3 to 4 games leading up to his injury, he was really starting to look like that college running back that he did at San Diego State. And in San Diego State, he was electric. He was unreal. But this is a guy who is doubtful for week 1. But if you watch his videos on social media, he is moving well. So I don't think it's going to take long for him to get into the groove of things and get back into that depth chart. And when he does, he is someone who could have huge value, because Chris Carson started to struggle at the end of the year last year, had a tough time holding on to the ball, and Pete Carroll lost some trust in Chris Carson. It was clear they kind of put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands a little bit more, which, let's be honest, is not the worst thing. Russell Wilson's a top 5 quarterback. He makes plays every single time. So it wasn't the worst thing, but it's something to kind of keep an eye out for, because when Rashad Penny comes back, he could be a big-time performer. He's someone who you could get on the waiver wire, put him as a flex, and he could come into a running back 2 type position once he is healthy. But if we stay with the Seattle Seahawks as a running back by committee, we talked about how Chris Carson kind of lost some trust, and not saying he can't earn that trust back from Pete Carroll, but they went out and signed veteran running back Carlos Hyde. And now Carlos Hyde is a big, kind of rough, tumbling running back who has been solid everywhere he's gone. He's not going to blow you out of the water with his speed or anything, but he is going to grind out yards. He is a good, tough runner, and he's another guy who could give you some flex options, especially because the Seahawks are a run-first offense if they can be. So kind of all of these guys have potential to really break out any game that they're on the field, and that's why the Seattle Seahawks, it's one to be careful of, because who knows who's going to break out, but it's also one to buy on at the right time in your fantasy draft, because they always have the potential to break out. And that's why I'm a little higher on Rashad Penny than I am with Carlos Hyde, but it might take a week or two for Rashad Penny to really not only get healthy, but then get into the groove of things. So it might not be till week 6 or 7 where Rashad Penny is really kind of moving and grooving. And so that is why you got to watch out for him, and you could get him in a late week waiver wire, and he could pick up some big time yards for you. Now, as we move it a little forward, we're going to go to the Super Bowl champs, the Kansas City Chiefs, and they have a real interesting running back room. I mean, Damian Williams really came out in the Super Bowl and the playoffs and played well for them. And he's a starting running back, rightfully so. He should be. But now, they always kind of have that second backup guy who gets a lot of action, and they're a passing team. So that second guy, a lot of the times, is big in the passing game, kind of a scat back, roll it out, throw it on third down. So that's why even a bigger reason for the Kansas City Chiefs backup running back to be a big threat in fantasy football. And rookie out of LSU, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, or Hilar, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. I apologize. But this is someone who could really make a name for himself. Draft experts were very high on him. He's a first-round pick at the 32nd pick overall in this year's draft. So he has the talent, he has the ability to succeed, and then he gets put in Andy Reid's offense with Patrick Mahomes. That's a win-win situation. And honestly, as much Damian Williams is great. There's no denying that. But do not be surprised if Edwards-Helaire really picks up the pace and pushes Damian Williams for some carries, because he is kind of a do-it-all back that can swing out on third downs and catch the ball out of the backfield. So it's really someone who, in all different aspects of fantasy football, whether it's rushing the ball, getting those carries, or getting those receptions in a PPR league, points per reception, he has the opportunity to really bust out onto the scene and make a big difference for fantasy football owners this year. So that is one I am looking forward to following. And now, as we move it along, the next backup running back that I think could give you some fantasy football value is Chase Edmonds of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, this is a third-year back who I would not draft him. He's kind of a guy who is a streamer. You need a running back or you need a flex position guy, and he has a running back friendly matchup. This is a guy to go. Not only are the Arizona Cardinals improving as a whole, I think this offense is going to be extremely dynamic this year. And they do have Kenyon Drake, but Cliff Kingsbury is an air raid offense, and Chase Edmonds is another running back who is great out of the backfield in the passing game. He showed that last year. He had a lot of value in the pass game and had a couple big fantasy football games. And this is one guy you're going to have to play your cards right, to be honest. I'm not denying that. You're going to have to kind of get lucky in a way. But he is a name that is worth keeping on the radar as you move forward into the season. I'm not, for drafts, this is not a draftable guy. I'm going to say that right now. Do not draft him. But for a waiver wire guy, he's someone who can really produce here and there throughout the season. He's not going to blow you away with his past stats. He only rushed for 300 yards, but I think he could have an expanded role in this offense as people get more comfortable with Cliff Kingsbury in the NFL. And Kyler Murray, I think, is only going to get better and better. He had a great rookie year, and that is going to make this offense function at a much higher rate. And they play a lot of high-quality teams over there in the NFC West, which is all the more reason for it to be competitive games a lot where they need their running backs to be performing at a high level. And Kenyon Drake has never really been a three-down pounded back. So while that's going to play to his advantage in an air raid offense like this, he's going to need some backup guys and some reinforcements at times. But that's a guy I'm high on for a streamer-like pick, or kind of streamer keep an eye on for. Now, this next guy I'm excited to talk about because I love rookies, and they are an interesting draft case a lot of the times. And that's why I'm going to be taking a look at J.K. Dobbins, Baltimore Ravens rookie out of the Ohio State University. And now this is a running back who was an absolute beast in college. He had 3 seasons rushing over 1,000 yards, including his third year, just this past 2019 college football season, where he rushed for 2,000 yards and had 21 touchdowns. On top of that, he had almost 250 yards in the passing game. So it kind of gives you that dynamic, how good this guy can be. And, you know, he isn't really going to be that third down back for the Ravens. Obviously, they have Mark Ingram, so he's going to get a bulk of the carries. But John Harbaugh has shown to be willing to give people chances to succeed, especially with Lamar Jackson in a running offense. They run kind of a read option, and there's so much focus that goes into Lamar Jackson and containing him. It allows these running backs to get holes that open up bigger than most teams, because Lamar, it's pretty much having a 2 running back backfield in a way. And if you look at J.K. Dobbins' draft traits as he kind of came into the league, he was very big with ball security and receiving, have kind of elite traits, and those are big in the NFL. But one of the things he also excels at is being able to set up defenders as he still stays behind that offensive line. If you watch his film, he's very patient, and you can tell he has that vision to figure out what the defender is thinking and bounce around the offensive line and really take that speed to the next level and be able to bust a run into the end zone whenever he touches the ball. And he showed in 2019 as a college running back that he has the ability to be a workhorse. He can handle all 3 downs. And now I don't think he's going to be asked that in the NFL, especially his first year with Mark Ingram still in Baltimore. But I think he is going to have a lot more opportunities and carries than some people think. Now, it's tough to value where to draft rookies like this when they're not exactly a starter. So if you're going to draft him, obviously take him in the last 2 or 3 rounds, and I don't think you're going to have a problem getting him. You're not. I think he is going to be available 100%. People aren't going to risk it or risk a high pick with a running back like this. So that is the one plus out of J.K. Dobbins, is you don't have to pick a high draft pick. But if you don't even want to use a draft pick, if you wait a little bit, I can guarantee you he's going to be there on the waiver wire. Give it 2 to 3 weeks, and he's going to be making a difference with the Baltimore Ravens. They have such an explosive offense. They really share the ball around, and I think J.K. Dobbins could be a huge asset to that team. So now as we're moving forward, this is a guy who I kind of died on the fence last year with. He was absolutely destroyed by a running back by committee, and that is Chicago Bears, David Montgomery, out of Ohio State. I'm so used to J.K. Dobbins. Out of Iowa State. I'm sorry for getting that wrong. But David Montgomery, Chicago Bears, if they really give him the chance to be that main number 1 guy, and it sounds like they're going to be, there's going to be a lot of high expectations for David Montgomery. He could be something special in this league. He has the ability to be a all 3-down back workhorse. So if Matt Nagy can just give him the opportunity to do so, Dave Montgomery could be a very, very good running back. And now this is another guy you could get in the 8 to 10 round range, kind of where you get to the spot, that sweet spot in your draft where you're willing to take a couple risks, see where it's going to pan out. And I mean, he almost rushed for 1,000 yards last year, just under 900. So you give him the ball a lot more because he didn't get the ball that much last year. That's the big problem, is it's not like he was their workhorse or their number 1 guy. He kind of got killed by the running back by committee concept in football. So I think he's going to kind of amp up his carries and his usage and could be a huge asset. Someone who people they're going to be drafting him as a running back 3 to flex position. He could be a big time running back 2 if given the ability. And that's the thing. You got to find that right spot in the draft that you're willing to take these risks and kind of gamble on a big maybe like this, because trust me, I did last year and it didn't pay out. But all the rumors around the league, you go around and read some articles, it looks like people are thinking the Chicago Bears are finally going to give David Montgomery that opportunity to be maybe not the workhorse, because Tariq Cohen is still a very talented running back, but give him a lot of opportunities to finally kind of get used to what's going on in the NFL and be a big-time running back. Now, this final running back I am going to kind of give a little sneak peek to, and he's not the starter, and that's Tevin Coleman. And this is an interesting case. He is the backup running back in San Francisco, but he at times was the starter last season. He really had like a solid 5 to 6 game stretch where he was producing for fantasy football. And the thing with him is he's not the every down starter, but he is their goal line back. So he will get those touchdowns for you. I think it was 6 or 7 touchdowns. Let me look at my notes. Yeah, 6 touchdowns last year, under 600 yards. So it's not like he's going to pound the ball for you, but he's going to get that red zone look, and that is big. Kyle Shanahan likes to use him out of the backfield in the passing game. And Raheem Mostert really did come on at the end of the season and show that he could be very productive in Kyle Shanahan's system. But then a couple weeks ago, he requested a trade because he wasn't getting paid where he thought he should have been. So it kind of makes you think, is Tevin Coleman at some point in this season going to take over this Niners running room and be the number one guy? Kyle Shanahan has showed he's not afraid to kind of lean on one guy for a certain game here and there or change it up. And it's this guy's game. So it gives you a lot of things to kind of dive into and think about as you draft these guys. And now some of these guys, or if not all of these guys that I've been talking about in this segment, aren't exactly high draftable guys. They're not someone you want to be taking big risks on in the super high round, whether it's the 5, 6, you can still get values out of full-blown starters in those picks. So these are guys that can be running back 3s or flex position guys that is where you win fantasy football. It's these depth guys, because everyone can draft the big-time stars and have them produce. But when you have these guys towards the bottom of the roster and you can have them excel and you really excel, can't even speak. When you have them excel and succeed, those are the 2 words I just tried to put together. That didn't work. But when you have these bottom of the roster or second in the depth chart type of players and they start playing well for you, that is where your team becomes a winner and you can bring home the cash, or maybe you don't have to do the dare that some fantasy football team leagues have you do. So these are guys to kind of keep an eye on for, whether you're drafting them late in rounds, or if you're looking at these guys as streamers or waiver wire pickups. It's just names that are good to be aware of, especially in a volatile season such as this that we're going into, where there might be times when a handful of guys get sick and are down for the count, and these backup running backs get thrusted into the limelight and are all of a sudden the starters. So these are big things to consider, and that is why it is important to think about these guys as you head into your drafts and as you get into the season and you start looking at the waiver wire, because the leagues are won in the waiver wire. So there you have it. Those are kind of my backup or sleeper running backs to pay attention to. Know the value in them. Don't draft them too high, but when you find the right spot, do not be afraid to take these guys. So stick around after the break, and I'm going to be doing a similar thing, but on receivers. So thank you for listening. Stick around after the break, and we will get into the receiver position a little bit.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered. Listen, it's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
everybody. Thank you for making it this far with me, Grady Duggan, the host of GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I appreciate all of you guys. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. We talked about COVID. We talked about some quarterbacks. We talked about some running backs. And now we are going to be talking about the receiver position, which is really one of the positions that can help you get over that edge in fantasy football. And similar to the running backs that I talked about, these are going to be guys who might not be crazy high value in the draft. They might not be that number one guy, but they're receivers who you can get value out of later in the draft. And I know I use that term a lot, value, but that's what it comes down to in fantasy football, especially in a season during a global pandemic when things are so unpredictable. So let's get to it. I'm not going to stray away from a team that I was just talking about. We're staying in San Francisco. We're staying with the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan. And I'm talking about Kendrick Bourne, an undrafted free agent out of Eastern Washington. This is his fourth year in the NFL, and each year he has gotten better and better and better. So if you look at his production, it's not like he has crazy high yards. He only had 358 yards last season, but he had 5 touchdowns, which is a lot for someone who only has 358 yards, which shows that he has that red zone ability and he can break. He's a great route runner. His slants, he gets away from the defender very easily. And one thing that's big is not only does he have 5 touchdowns, but he also was their top third down receiver. And that is big because that shows he has that trust in Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo has the ability and the confidence in Kendrick Bourne to throw it to him when the situation is, everything is on the line. He says, Kendrick Bourne is my guy. And I think Kendrick Bourne has the ability to really be a big time breakout receiver. And last year, the 49ers had Emmanuel Sanders down the stretch, and that really helped elevate Deebo Samuel's game. And I think Deebo Samuel's going to need another guy to do that same thing. And Kendrick Bourne is going to be that guy, in my opinion. Don't be surprised if by the end of the year, if he stays healthy, Kendrick Bourne has 800, if not over 1,000 yards. I know that's a big jump from 400, but each year, this is a receiver who has gotten better and better, and he's built more and more trust with his quarterback. And that is why I think Kendrick Bourne could be a big-time receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. Now, we are going to stay in the NFC West and talk about a team that we have already talked about, and that's the Arizona Cardinals. And I'm going to be looking at Christian Kirk. The thing that's hard with the Arizona Cardinals to value is they have so many weapons now. They have DeAndre Hopkins and they have Larry Fitzgerald. So where is Christian Kirk going to kind of fit in to this offense? That's a good question, but the thing is this is an air raid offense. They're going to be throwing the ball 30, 40 times a game. And when you get that many balls in the air, you're bound to get 7 to 8 targets a game with a receiver like Christian Kirk. And he's a small kind of shifty receiver in the slot that Kyler Murray had great chemistry with last year. He had 700 yards or a little over 700 yards in his second year. And really, he's that guy that can excel because there's so much focus riding on DeAndre Hopkins and Larry Fitzgerald that teams not exactly, I don't know if forget is the right word, but they're going to have their third corner for a safety or a nickelback or even a linebacker on him at times. He's going to get the matchups that he needs to really break out. So this is a guy that kind of drafted him in the later 10 to 13 round range. And he's not going to be some big time producer, but he's going to have a handful of games for you that it's going to be a good thing you had him in your lineup. He's a good running back. He's a good wide receiver 3 or flex position guy that could really, really break out and be a big time receiver when the Arizona Cardinals need it. And now, as we move forward in this list, someone who really showed what he is capable of last season on the Washington football team is Terry McLaurin, a second year receiver out of the Ohio State. And he is a small, shifty receiver that can beat you deep, which is big in the NFL, especially with a quarterback like Dwayne Haskins, who has a big-time arm. It's huge to have that speed threat, vertical threat that can stretch the defense. And Terry McLaurin almost had 1,000 yards in his rookie year, had a lot of big games. And now he's going to be kind of tasked and really expected to be that number one receiver and take that responsibility. And the Washington football team, I don't expect them to be very good and very competitive in a certain amount of games. And if they're down big late in the game, that means that they're going to be passing the ball. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Terry McLaurin to continue to produce late in the game. Maybe you get that fourth quarter touchdown that you really need moving forward. So it's someone to look out for you could probably, he's going to go a little higher than some of these guys I've been talking about. Like the 6 to 8 round range is when I think you're going to see McLaurin coming off the board. So he's one that you have to be careful with. You have to know the value. And I think he could be a really good producer for your fantasy football team. So please pay attention to that. Don't value him too high just because he might be that number one guy in the offense, because their offense might be struggling at times this year. So especially with a new system with Ron Rivera, a lot of just off the field issues going on in that locker room. And there's already enough going on with COVID-19. So that's where you can maybe get him a little later in the draft and he can be a big time. I'm talking wide receiver 2 producer. So something to pay attention for. Now, as we move down the coast a little bit, we're going to the Miami Dolphins, a team that I haven't talked about much, but really at the end of the year last year started to improve a great amount and played really well and was competitive in a lot of games. And that's because of the grit that this team played with for Coach Flores. And now one of their receivers, kind of the second guy behind Devontae Parker, is Preston Williams. And he was a rookie out of Colorado State, I believe, kind of a tall, lengthy, 6'5", 220-pound receiver. So he has that red zone threat. He has that kind of ability to go up above defenders and stretch the ability for the quarterbacks to throw it high. He's a wide catch radius, and I think Preston Williams could really take that second-year leap that NFL evaluators look for in their talent after drafting him. They say it's that second year where they make that big leap and they show you what you are really getting. And so I think Preston Williams could be a big-time performer this year, especially now. I mean, maybe not right off the bat since they have Ryan Fitzpatrick, but I would expect Tua Tagovailoa to get some sort of opportunity at some time in the season and expect Preston Williams to really benefit from that all around. I mean, the whole offense as a whole, but the receivers especially because of who is throwing them the football. So it's an interesting offense to be paying close attention to, but it's an offense where you can kind of pick the value and kind of see. Not a lot of people are going to be high on Miami Dolphin players because of so many question marks, and they haven't been that good the past couple years. So it's a team that you can wait on and pick up a little later in the draft and see some big-time production at certain games. So just a team and a player in Preston Williams to look out for later on in the draft. Now, as we move forward an inch closer to the end of this GSMC Fantasy Football podcast, one of the last guys I want to talk about, it's 2 guys on the same team. It's kind of a receiver room aside from their number one guy, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers. And they have 2 very interesting options in James Washington and Deontay Johnson. Not only is this offense as a whole going to take a big leap because because Ben Roethlisberger is back, they don't have Mason Rudolph or Devlin Hodges throwing him the ball. So that's a big time jump for an offense. They get a veteran Hall of Fame quarterback back. They're going to be getting more opportunities. They're going to be more competitive throughout games, and they're going to be throwing the ball. Let's be honest. The Pittsburgh Steelers have always been a passing team. And now you look at James Washington. This is a speedster out of Oklahoma State. He is one of the fastest guys in the league, and people don't realize that. And now that Ben Roethlisberger is back, it's going to put a lot more value on Juju Smith-Schuster, and it's going to force teams to really focus on him. And James Washington put up almost 800 yards in his second year in the NFL, and I expect him to continue progressing and making that leap forward. Now, this is a guy you're going to be able to get in kind of the 8 to 12 round range. People don't really know about him. He's a little bit under the radar type player, so that's a one to look out for and value as you move forward in your fantasy football drafts. And now as we move down their depth chart and we go to their third receiver in Deontay Johnson, this is another shifty speedster, and while he can stretch the top, he's a little slot receiver at 5'10", and he moves quick, he runs his routes well, he's very crisp in his cuts. So a lot of the times NFL defenders, they're already pedaling back and they're not ready for these cuts, and it greatly helps players like Deontay Johnson. This is a guy you're going to be able to get even later in the draft, if not the last couple picks. It's not going to be often this guy is getting drafted, which is a huge benefit for you. You can sit back, you can kind of wait, watch what teams are valuing him at, and jump on it at the right time, because he is a great flex option. Again, none of these guys that I am going over, I'm expecting to be huge receiver one performers, but they're guys who you're going to be able to get value out of in the right draft slots, and you can kind of mix and match. They're great to have on your bench if you need to get a wide receiver 3 or a flex position in, or you need to pick someone up off the waiver wire. It's kind of that sort of thing where these guys can really come in and help out a fantasy football team and really take you to that next level. Or if someone's hurt and you need someone just to be a little consistent, keep the points up to some extent as you just need to stay competitive in your fantasy football league, these guys are your guys. You know, I named guys like Deontay Johnson, James Washington, Kendrick Bourne is one person I'm really excited about, Christian Kirk, all sorts of guys. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you got some input as we inch closer and closer to the fantasy football draft. And as we get closer to these drafts, I'm going to be taking a more in-depth look at players, because this is when you need to have the most information on these players. And I think I'm going to be able to give you guys some input on a lot of different players. Some are going to be bigger names, some are not going to be as big names, but that's what you need to be very educated all around as you move closer to these drafts. It's something exciting. We're finally getting into the nitty gritty, into the good stuff. So it's fun. So, you know, we talked about kind of the NFL's procedures moving forward with COVID-19. We went over some quarterbacks that aren't going to be valued as high as some other quarterbacks, but have the ability to perform. Or there was a couple quarterbacks like Gardner Minshew and Nick Foles that I said to kind of wait it out on and don't necessarily go big on them, but they could be productive at certain times. They're good streamers. We went over some backup running backs that are going to be able to give you value. And then last but not least, I just told you a little bit about some receivers that kind of under the radar. This was an under the radar episode, which is good because that is how you get value at the end of your drafts or the middle to end of your drafts. And it really catapults you in to that next level of fantasy football and is able to bring home the big ship. Because let's be honest, you want those bragging rights with your friends. You either want the cash, or if teams have a dare or a challenge at the end, you don't want to be doing that. And these are the guys that help you get there. So I really appreciate you guys listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the one and only GSMC Podcast Network. If you guys have a chance, I would like to ask you, please remember, subscribe to the show, write a nice review below. It really helps us out as we grow this podcast network. Also, if you have the chance, go on Twitter, go on Facebook, go on Instagram, give us a follow. We really appreciate it over here at GSMC Podcast Network. So Thank you again, guys. I appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.